Hello, the purpose of this video is to assist you with writing a solid outline for the final term paper for GD2 History of Graphic Design. What we'll do is we'll start with some general guidelines for writing an outline and then work more specifically to how they pertain to this class, and then I'll show you somewhat of an example. And I say somewhat of an example because it's always, usually a bad idea if the instructor shows you too specific, like something that some student did before, because then the idea tends to get stuck in everyone's head that this is exactly how it should be. So I'm going to try to keep it generic as far as the examples go, but still hopefully answer questions that might be lingering around in your head and giving you difficulty in getting started and finishing up the project. Also, if you're struggling with the thesis, I'll give some pointers there as well. Modules for the class that you're taking, and it may vary. I'm actually showing this in a accelerated 8-week version of the class, but it doesn't matter. When you get to the week that you are supposed to be watching this video, the video will be in the modules, and then just a week or two prior to that would have been the introduction to the term paper. So you have that as a resource, but I just want to show you, so ignore that this may not be week number 7 for all of you. For the accelerated course, probably will be. So what you do is, for the week that's appropriate, you click on term paper outline, and then in here you're going to see a couple things. One is the video that you're watching right now will be inserted in here, and the other thing is I'm going to be talking a bit about the information that's contained in this link here. Now, this happens to be a high school in New York, but they just happen to have a very great example of outlining and just some very specific things that can really help you in this paper. Now, I've rewritten this, and I'll show you that. So it's a little bit more specific to our class, but I just want to let you know where this is coming from. You will have availability to this link, and then that way you can go in, you can click on the additional links here, and especially for someone who hasn't recently taken a college class, or especially a college writing class, this can just be a very good source either to get you up to par where you need to be to write a college level paper, or just as a reminder of a few things. And we'll come back to this together in a little while, but let me just show you as it pertains more specifically to our paper how I've modified what you'll see on that website. So for one thing, for us, for your outline, you do not have to cite your sources. You definitely will do that at the time you turn in the term paper, but since this class potentially moves kind of quickly, just want at this point to make sure that you're doing the research, that you have a pretty good idea of how you will formulate the paper, and that is the whole purpose of the outline. So do keep that in mind, that even though you're not required to cite, that the whole purpose, or a main purpose, of this outline is to allow your instructor to see if you're on the right track towards a good term paper. So if you do a great deal of research before you turn the term paper in, it's going to be much better experience for you and much easier for me to give you advice. As of the due date for your outline, you're not required to have 100% of your research completed, but you need to have enough done to write an intelligent outline. But the point is that it is possible and acceptable that your final paper could vary a bit from your outline, but it should just be a bit. Otherwise, it just, you've got to do it in the stages. You've got to come up with your thesis, you've got to outline your thesis, all the while doing research, and then write that final paper based on the final dose of research. So I will be showing you both this outline template and then an example of an outline. Both of them are meant to be a little bit vague as far as the topics that are discussed. So in no case is this template, which is why I have it in quotation marks, meant to be a template that you just simply drop in the names of your designers and your art movements. Okay, so now let's finally start discussing the outline itself. So this is a good way to write an outline, starting with number 1, and then indents will lead you to A, B, C, further indents to lowercase I and II. The key thing, though, is just to make sure that you have an indent system that makes logical sense. So you're starting with your introduction. Now, the purpose of this will be to lead us into what you will be discussing and to state your thesis. Now, it depends on your ultimate writing style, how much of this will all be stated in just this thesis, or how much build-in you will need to get. So for example, you could, and well, you should always start by getting the reader's attention. And examples on that website included asking a leading question or relaying something enticing about the subject matter that commands attention, aka a hook. You could start with a related quote, an alluring description, narration, or a germane antidote. Now, you may or may not have as much here as other people, depending on how thick your thesis is. So if your thesis is one big chunky sentence that includes a lot of this, then that may work. But if that starts to feel too heavy to the reader, you definitely want to bring them in lightly and then state your thesis. But maybe your thesis doesn't, for example, actually include the names of the movements that the designer's from, because you already got to it in here. So for example, if your thesis is going to be something like this: although designer A is from such and such a movement and designer B is from a different movement, they share the following, and you go on to list what they share and in short terms how you're going to prove that or make that clear to us. Now, what I was saying earlier is if the lead-in in this actually lists what design movements they're from, you may not have to spell that out in your thesis. Like, you could be more generic in your thesis and say, although they come from 2 different design movements. Right? So again, we're just kind of staying like generic in my example here, just so that your style can dictate how this paper, and for right now, this outline actually gets written. And remember to hit the pause button anytime you want to continue reading something that I've only read part of. Then you build the body. And, in super generic terms, you assert a major point, you explain it, you give facts, statistic, quotes, authority, whatever, examples. You get the idea across with proper citing. It's a college paper. And then you go on to the next explanation, whatever it takes. Then you get to the conclusion. Make sure your conclusions are strong. We as instructors for this class tend to read a lot of papers that are good, and then they're summed up in a very strange way, like, so in conclusion, designer A and designer B were famous designers that had a lasting impact on graphic design. That's not what your paper was about, so don't make your conclusions something different than what your paper was about. It's basically a shortened version of your paper. And I'll point out some suggestions on the website right now about conclusions. So whether you go back to this on your own or just pause it right now and read it, I'm just going to point out some things along the way that are pertinent. So make sure you put a lot of time into the conclusion, just like you did into the introduction and the body. It's a chance to have your last word on your paper, but don't bring up anything brand new. You're just kind of reiterating in an interesting way what you've already told us. I really like the way they word this paragraph here, so please go through and read that. Just again, be careful not to start with something brand new in there, just a reiteration or maybe just a little bit more thought-provoking. And here's some suggestions to write the outline. Go through your research again, see if there's something that you found in there that it just gives you just that little spark that you need in there just to make people, I mean, the main purpose is to kind of just say, hey, you know, like I told you I was going to tell you this, not obviously in that kind of language, but I told you I was going to tell you this, and that's what I did, and I'm leaving you with this final thought. This is one way to think of it. Synthesize, don't summarize. And just as important as the suggestions we just saw are the things to avoid. So avoid the overused phrases such as in conclusion, in summary. Stating the thesis for the very first time is an obvious bad way to write a paper. Stating it in the conclusion. Introducing a new idea or subtopic. No, we're just working with what we've already done, but in a new, fresh way. And like E says, don't make it all of a sudden sound like somebody else is writing the paper. Stay with the logic that you've already started with. Don't include brand new evidence in there that should have been in the rest of the paper. So like I said, some really good suggestions here. Before we move on and look at an example outline, let me just talk a little bit more about thesis. Back in the term paper topic, I included a video that you can watch there that talks about formal aspects of graphic design. And I usually find for students in this class, that's the easier or the most solid way to go, where you know you're going to write a good paper, where you're looking at formal aspects like line, shape, anything that goes along the form, the things that are actually there that we can see with our eyes. Now, concept is another possibility to write this paper on, but usually that requires an in-depth understanding of graphic design already and or advertising. So concept goes way beyond, like, just for example, them selling the same product. That would be a horrible way to write the paper, because just because someone came up in graphic design in the early 1900s and someone now in the 2000s, and they're both selling tires, that has nothing to do with the design movement or anything that you could really sink your teeth into and write intelligently about. So if you don't understand conceptual design and how that can translate and arise out of design movements, then again, just focus on formal aspects. And I'll kind of give some examples as we look at the example of the outline. It's a kind of a not so elegant way of saying this is, don't come up with a thesis that would leave your reader thinking like, yeah, so what's your point? That doesn't seem that unlikely. Your thesis should more get to the point of, look, this person is from this design movement, this person is from that design movement. These two design movements are clearly different things, but yet through my research, I found at least two samples, two different pairs of work that we can look at and we can find some similarities. That's an interesting conversation there. So now let's look at somewhat of an example. Now, you'd probably never start a paper off with wording like, how could it be, blah, blah, blah. But, I just don't want to take everything or many things away that might feel like you can't start and get creative. So trying to leave it as wide open as possible. But anyway, so you basically want to, the premise of the introduction is that you got two designers, two different movements, yet they have some commonalities. Now, if you don't mention the movements up here, then you'll need to mention them in the actual thesis. But it's important that you label thesis, semicolon, and then state your thesis. If it's a redo because you didn't get it quite right the week that it was due, please state that it's a redo by just putting the word redo in parentheses before the semicolon. That way I can pay more attention to it and make sure I give you some feedback on the new thesis. Now, will you need other bullet points here, C, D, and E? I don't know. It depends how you write this. Okay, body. We need a brief background, but as I've stated before, very brief. This is not a biographical paper. It is a paper that proves the thesis that we talked about earlier.